Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Sean King, and today I'm having a conversation with Keith Knight and Brent Lengle. We actually had one conversation about a year ago or so. And Brent is generally an anarcho-communist, and Keith is generally an anarcho-capitalist. And so we had a general conversation about just trying to get to the core differences between those viewpoints. So today we're going to have another conversation, and if you guys could both introduce yourselves, starting with Keith.
Hey, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. My name is Keith Knight. I run the Don't Tread on Anyone show. I'm on BitChute, Minds, Archive.org, as well as YouTube. My general focus is history, economics, and developing a consistent philosophy that is that allows for people to live in a social setting that doesn't violate the rights of anyone and allows them to enjoy their lives to the fullest extent without initiating aggression against others. So the philosophy is libertarianism or voluntarism or anarcho-capitalism. That is what I advocate at Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone.
And hi, my name is Brenton Lengle. I am a poet, playwright, Appalachian Trail 2000 miler. I've had 7 plays produced in New York City. I'm the author of the Snow White Zombie comic book series, which the second issue is about to come out. So that's really exciting. And I'll be running another successful Kickstarter to fund the third. And then I'm also a novelist working with a band called the Crew Shadows on a fantasy novel that should be coming out in the next year or so. Fingers crossed.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I'm an activist. I was very active with Occupy Wall Street. Did some journalism, and I had a show called Insurrection with Brenton Lengle, which was carried on the Starcom radio network, and had anywhere from 100,000 to 1 million listeners a show before I gave it up to focus on writing.
Awesome. Okay, so we'll just jump into it, and we're going to start with a specific topic, and then we'll branch out to, whatever topic comes up. And so our starting topic is, do businesses have the right to discriminate in who they sell to? And obviously what comes to mind for me is, segregation, Jim Crow. There's that case where a bakery refused to make a wedding cake for a same-sex couple. So let's just hear what you guys have to think about that, starting with Keith.
Well, I would, with all respect to the moderator here, I would say it's not do businesses have the right to discriminate. I think the question is, do people have the right to discriminate? Whether it's in any aspect of their lives, whether it's their friends, their roommates, who they associate with, who they work with, who they sell to. I don't see people entering the business realm and morality altering. So you have the right to discriminate until you get to a place that sells stuff, and now you have to sell to basically everyone who wants your services. I think people own their own bodies because with regard to others, they have the better claim to their time, and no one else is entitled to your time. And if you create anything through voluntary exchange or original appropriation, you have the right to include and exclude others however you see fit. Now, generally, that is my moral case. People have the right to discriminate because the inverse of that would be forced association. I do not believe people should be forced to associate with other people, whether it's in the labor realm. Employees have the right to say, screw you, Mr. Employer, I go elsewhere, for whatever reason. I'd be interested to look into why some people leave and why some people stay, but the right still lies with that employee. If that employee starts hiring other people for themselves, well, they still have that right to discriminate. The fact that money and commerce is involved doesn't stop people from having the right to freely associate and disassociate with whoever they want for whatever means. Muhammad Ali famously has that skit on Dick Cavett's show where he says, well, I'm a black guy and I want to have black kids and I have the right to discriminate because, hey, it's my body. This is the life I want to lead. I don't see anything inherently wrong with that. I see it as him choosing to exclude based on whatever method he feels is best for his life. I do think this applies in the business realm because if you have the right to produce nothing and, say, watch TV all day, well, if I produce, 100 pieces of cake and sell them to 99 people but exclude one person, look, it's important that that one person knows that I don't like them because they're gay, black, a socialist, from France, or whatever. Because then they can say, hey, screw that Keith guy. Thank God I know that he doesn't like me, so I could not give him my money. Without the ability to freely discriminate, that wall is put up where we can't see who does not like us and who wishes to disassociate with us. My case is both moral, people have the right to freely associate, and economical. When there's a freer market, people have more options, they have more competitors, and they are less likely to go without the things that make life enjoyable. That's my general case for why people have the right to freely discriminate.
Yeah,
Brandon, you can just jump in. Yeah.
Okay. So I've heard this argument a lot from anarcho-capitalists, libertarians, voluntarists. This is not a particularly new argument. In fact, this is an argument that goes straight back, as you mentioned, to segregation. Now, here's the deal. So first off, the ethics that Keith has advanced, this is what we call deontological ethics. There's essentially two types of morality. There's deontological and consequentialist. Deontological is rule-based. You select an arbitrary rule for whatever reason, and you say, this is what morality is, don't break the rule. The second form of human morality that we tend to is consequentialist, where you go and you say, oh, okay, so this action is likely to have this outcome, and we can judge the morality of the action based upon the outcome. I think it's kind of a false dichotomy to cleave entirely to deontological ethics or entirely to consequentialist ethics. You don't want to cleave too much to consequentialist ethics because we don't know the future. And we can't, like the famous trolley problem. But also at the same time, you really don't want to cleave too closely to deontological ethics because one, that's not how humans make moral decisions. It's simply not. And two, the issue with deontological ethics is that the law and rules, they are not really, it's a blunt instrument. And so what happens is that when you enforce a law or a rule, you run into situations where it either does not apply or should not apply or is in fact dangerous to apply within that situation. So I'm seeing a lot of hasty equivocations and a lot of very, I guess to a certain extent, myopic ways of looking at morality, which is not a slam on Keith. Like I said, I've heard this stuff a lot, but what happens is that I don't think people think this through enough. On one hand, and then on the other hand, what happens is that they may not be aware of the civil rights history, because these kind of arguments were made by segregationists, and this was yet another in a long line of attempts to keep black people enslaved and to keep populations under their heel. First, they had the legal authority and the ability to beat them and kill them and take their property and sell them like cattle. When this failed and they lost the Civil War, then they said, okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to have the legal separation, and they enacted Jim Crow laws. When this yet again failed, because it was obviously inhuman and obviously immoral, what they fell back on is informal segregation, where business owners could have the segregated lunch counters, and that again failed. As a result of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, as a result of multiple Supreme Court decisions. And one of the big reasons why is that people are equal under the law. So if you have a law like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, you can't pick and choose and decide, oh, this person is, this person gets represented by it, but this person does not. In the case of, for instance, a gay couple who wants a wedding cake made like everyone else, or a woman who wants to buy birth control and a guy who doesn't want to sell her the birth control because he's a religious fanatic. The fact is that by denying basic services to a class of people based not upon what they do, but who they are, you dehumanize them. And this process is called pseudo-speciation, where in order to do something horrible to another human being, we all have a natural block in our brains that's been bred in by evolution, because you don't want to eat or kill your own kind. So if you want to rape someone or kill someone or steal from them, one of the things that people will have to do is to convince themselves that this other person they're about to hurt is not actually a person, is not part of their species. Usually they want to put them up as idiots or animals or robots. And you'll even see this in how the alt-right likes to talk about people. Well, they'll call them NPCs, or they'll use various racial slurs, or they will go in for like the R word or whatever. So what happens is that you erode compassion and you trick your own mind and the mind of others into thinking of this group of people as not people. And once those groups of people are not people, they can be abused and killed and harmed in any number of ways. It's rare that this happens like to people who are fairly high on the social totem pole, like myself, white male, from a fairly well-to-do family. But the lower you get on the social totem pole, the more likely you are to be outgrouped in this way, and the more dangerous these kinds of dehumanizing tactics can be. So, when you segregate drinking fountains and when you segregate a swimming pool, what happens is that you send the message to everyone that not just that this individual person doesn't like this other individual person, but that these people categorically are less than other people. And this in turn invites it invites discrimination, it invites hardship against them, and it invites some of the most antisocial and monstrous behaviors that humans can have.
Okay, let's try and get Keith back in here soon.
Yeah, so absolutely. So I'll come straight to the end here. So my point on this is that when you're talking about deontological morality and consequentialist morality, what you need to do is you need to have a conversation between the two types of morality. And it is that conversation that comes to what we can consider a genuine moral decision. And what's important here is that we need to hold into account, one, consistent rules that we can all obey at a time, and two, we need to base these rules in the likely compassionate outcome towards everyone. We have seen these tactics used before, and they have resulted in some of the most monstrous things that our society has ever done. So, as much as I can sympathize with what Keith wants, broadly, when you get into the specific situation, you really need to judge this on a case-by-case basis and understand that not everything is the same from one context to another.
So, I absolutely appreciate the negative effects that have come from first separating one group from another. Say, only by separating whites and blacks some white part of the population able to enslave the other. But I don't think that justifies coercing association today because other people chose to do immoral actions in the past. So, for example, the things that come to mind are babysitters, mostly female, nurses, mostly female. At Hooters or strip clubs, they hire pretty much only women. And is this sort of separation, this discrimination against men, going to lead back to the draft, where men are enslaved by the millions? They get their hands blown off, they get maimed, they have to have limbs cut off by surgeons. As bad as the draft was, I don't say, well, there was a draft, therefore you don't have the right to discriminate against men today. And the draft was male only. So that is an example of just because of historical injustices does not justify coercing association today. As far as me only focusing on deontological, I did mention the fact that advocating a free market allows for more competition, more opportunities. So if person X is a bigot, well, I still have A, B, C, and D. Whereas if there's a lot of regulation or you can't enter the market without a state license, well, I have fewer options than I otherwise would. The other utilitarian aspect I mentioned, but might not have gone over as well as I'd like to have, is so I come from a Jewish background, even though I'm not practicing and am an actual atheist and no longer involved. But if someone says, we don't like Jews, we don't serve to libertarians, while that is traumatic and very disheartening, it's important that I'm able to know that so I can discriminate against them with my dollars. I don't want to be giving my money to someone who absolutely hates libertarians or hates whites or hates men or people from Arizona or people who have divorced parents or whatever the case may be. As far as segregation, I do support voluntary segregation. I think there is an important difference between people self-segregating voluntarily, because I don't know what kind of life you want to live. If you want to just live with Mormons or just live with men or just live with whites or just live with people in a senior citizen home, or women just want to be around other women, or black entertainment television only wants to be around their group for a certain amount of time and then resegregate for another aspect of their lives, I think that's totally up to them. I don't know what's best for other people in all these realms of their life. That's why I am very, very weary of saying, I'm so sure that I'm going to force you to integrate. That is my general response to Brent's points. I'm happy to hear what he has to say.
Okay, I think we should stay specifically on kind of like the Jim Crow era a little bit, because I think that's the most egregious example of this, and where you can really see the most negative effects of it. So can we talk about that and like try not to go off on tangents like related to the issue? Let's just stick with this for a little bit. So if Brent, can you get back into that?
Sure. Let me give you a really good example as to the kinds of, I guess, reactions that happen because of this. And I'm trying to, sorry, I got a little thrown because there were a few things that Keith said that I wanted to respond to, but I'm going to lock in and then stick with Jim Crow, just to give you guys an example as to how bad and how wrong this can go. So when we talk about, for instance, like how things should be, like if someone says that they believe that force shouldn't be used to do this. My old professor in college used to always talk about this. Should is a very, very dangerous word, because lots of things should happen, but regardless of how we think they should go, the actual impacts on reality are tend to be much more complicated than we actually think they would be. For instance, there was both the explicit and implicit practice of redlining that went on during the Jim Crow era and beyond the Jim Crow era, where government loans were denied to black individuals to buy homes and businesses in areas that they had cordoned off for whites only. So if you were a black guy and you had enough money, then you wanted to go buy a home on this side of the river where all the good businesses were and all the traffic was, you were physically unallowed. The bank would say, I don't want to write you that loan. And then even after these laws were made illegal, there were still implicit cultural biases that prevented black people in just the same way from being able to own their own homes and from being able to buy their own businesses and have a functioning economy. And this actually, going from that macro level, can manifest on the micro level in horrifying ways. For instance, the case of Freddie Gray in Baltimore. Freddie Gray was raised in one of these red-lined illegal tenements that had lead-lined paint in the walls. And as a child, he and his sisters actually grew up eating those paint chips. Now, my son is a toddler right now, and one of the things that's really important, I couldn't imagine having to raise him in a place that could literally poison him and ruin his life. And this is exactly what happened to Freddie Gray. And so not only did he get brain damage from the eating of the lead paint, but also it destroyed his grades growing up. He eventually did win a class action lawsuit against the landlord who had these illegal tenements, and was awarded a very large sum of money, along with him and his sisters. But with his diminished capacity for actual rational thought, what wound up happening was that predatory corporations swooped in and tricked him and his family and hundreds and thousands of others of African Americans who had been brain damaged in this way to sign over their set payments for a lump sum that got them pennies on the dollar. And really, a lot of them, because of the damage that had been done to their minds, did not have the presence of mind to actually be able to sign these contracts. Now, beyond that, what all of that led up to, of course, was when Freddie Gray, because ingesting of lead will cause someone to oftentimes be more impulsive, to be more aggressive, and to make bad decisions. And one of these bad decisions happened when he decided to run from the police after they profiled him and decided that he looked suspicious. They chased him down, they beat him, they threw him in the back of their paddy wagon, and they decided to take him for a rough ride where they basically did donuts all over the city and severed his spine in the back of that in the back of that paddy wagon. So again, what you see here is you see these things that, oh, you know, something should be this way, something should be another way. Oh, you know, people should be able to deny a housing loan to whomever they want for whatever reason they want, and they have a chance to go elsewhere. But the fact is, in reality, no, they don't have an option to go elsewhere. And not only do they not have a realistic option to go elsewhere, but when you do deny these basic things within society to people, it has disastrous impacts on the personal and the national level. And right now the country is in open revolt, and in largely due to this police murder. But again, the murder in Minneapolis, you know, was again a result of all of this, I mean, you know, for lack of a better word, karma. All of these horrible things that were done in the past combined to form a perfect storm of sorts, and now we've got you know, riots breaking out all over the country. So the fact is that discrimination against individuals on this kind of a level cannot be allowed to happen. And if you want to talk about force, you know, how much force, there's the force that would be employed to make sure that people have more freedom and more options, and the force that is currently employed that makes sure that these people have less options. So it's not really a force versus no force thing. It is how this force is used and how power is wielded in order to either maximize human flourishing or to abuse some and help others.
Sean, can I respond to that? Do you want to take this?
Yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead, Keith.
So yes, I think what happened to I was not familiar with Freddie Gray's background. I think that is terrible. Certainly, when providing someone with money, say the rent, you have an obligation to make sure that they get the money, and the other party has an obligation to make sure you have the product or service you agreed to. When there is, you know, paint chips that poison you, obviously this is a breach of contract. They should have paid. I am glad to hear that they were sued. That's devastating that he wasn't able to get the money that certainly was owed to him. I don't see how this justifies forcing people to associate when they otherwise wouldn't. My point, going back to my point of...
If I might, I did want to respond to this just really quickly. So the issue is not just associating when they don't want to. It's also... So, and this is why anarchists have famously said property is theft. When you're not just talking about the freedom of association and disassociation, you're also talking about the freedom to prevent someone from associating and to go where they want to. So, for instance, I don't think there's any ethical case that can be made to prevent the free movement of peaceful people. And I think you would agree with me on that, correct?
Correct.
Okay, so if there is no ethical reason to prevent the free movement of peaceful people, how can you have, for instance, a red line city? In the same way of national borders being closed off and that being immoral, it would also be immoral to prevent a black family that wants to move into a white neighborhood from doing so. Like, if they've got the money and there's people willing to sell, boom, there, done. So, I mean, again, what happens is like we talk about freedom, like the freedom to swing my fist ends where your nose begins. But the fact is that people's noses begin in much more subtle ways than other people don't. So when you allow a person to have one freedom, you also restrict the inverse freedom off the other end. So it's one or the other. And again, this is why I think we need to look both deontologically and consequentialist, because we need to look what makes society more free overall, or what restricts society overall. I mean, that's really what power is. It's the ability to add or restrict the available options to other people.
Okay, yeah, I can see that is I guess nothing rings false about that definition of power. As far as what we were discussing earlier about, you had said if they want to buy a house and there's a willing buyer and there's a willing seller, then they should be able to make it. I absolutely agree. My whole thing is the seller has to be willing and the buyer has to be willing, both parties. So even if they wish to, I mean, for example, Dr. Umar Johnson, Mark Lamont Hill, Louis Farrakhan, these are people who believe that blacks have group interests and should associate primarily amongst themselves. I don't see what's inherently wrong with that, or if whites or Asians or Jews especially really like to associate amongst themselves. That is discrimination, not in the commercial realm, but in any other aspects of life. So back to the examples I used about, can you discriminate against who you spend time with, or who you choose to sleep with, or who you choose to work for? I don't see you losing your right to freely associate or discriminate because money is involved or property is involved. Again, if I have the right to produce nothing, I should have the right to produce some things and then only sell to people that I want. On a utilitarian basis, it's better that I at least produce some and say only provide it to whites, because then other people can see how I produce it and then provide it to everyone else and then put me out of business. That, I would say, is a utilitarian approach. I also think it's important to say that I do not like people who discriminate based on accidents of birth. You see a baby and the baby is brown or black, and you've now made a judgment for how they should be treated for the rest of their life, really, based on none of their decisions. I hate that. I think it's so ridiculous that I want to know who these people are so we can discriminate against them and say, well,
we can know who. Yeah, we don't need like to allow economic discrimination to know who these people are. A lot of these people will tell you. Like I was recently on Modern Day Debate. I did a debate with Mike Enoch and Eric Stryker, and they'll straight up tell you they want to, well, they like to hide it and pretend like they want like a nice place for white people, but it's one of the things I caught Mike Enoch in was a lie, and you can look that up. When I debated the scientific racist J.F. Garape recently, and obliterated him, by the way, you can check that out on my YouTube channel as well. These guys, you can tell who's a bigot and who's not, but the thing is also is there's a whole economy for bigots out there. Like one of the things that I noticed, for instance, in the debate that we did with Mike Enoch and Eric Stryker, their fans were in the super chats throwing ridiculous super chats around. In fact, I think they were trying to bribe the channel into becoming like an alt-right channel, because you do like a debate with Modern Day Debate, and there'll be a $2, $3, $5 super chat. These people were throwing super chats with $10 and $20 at us, like over and over and over again. And the fact of the matter is that I have suspicions as to where this money is coming from. I think a lot of them may just be crazy people going into credit card debt for the movement. But the fact is that there is an economy around hate that has been built around hate by hateful people. Now, you also want to talk about like why should you not be able to discriminate against someone's identity when it comes to money in the process. And the fact is that we need money to live. So if you can hurt a person's livelihood, you can hurt that person, and you can effectively kill that person if they are unable to obtain the money that they need to pay rent, to buy food, to acquire medicine, which is why we take a harder hand against illegitimate discrimination in the workplace. For instance, a Nazi being fired for being a Nazi is a person who is being fired for what they have done. And what they have done is usually horrible, is usually, advocate or attempt to carry out genocide and assault. So it makes sense that someone would lose their job for that. Kicking someone out of a job or denying someone a job, not because of what they've done, but because of who they are, because that category of person is not, is not worthy of having a job and not worthy of earning money. Again, this is this process of dehumanization, because what you need to remember is that humans, we are incredibly suggestible creatures. We naturally conform to groups that we associate with, and we tend to conform to standards that are set around us. So the reason I think that people take a very hard line against this certain forms of discrimination and not others always is because, again, it can go wrong, and it can go wrong so hard. So, you talk about Louis Farrakhan, who, he's basically he's the Scientology of black nationalism. And you talk about some of the other folks who are like, okay, we just want to associate with our own. And that, I understand that impulse, especially if it's coming from a ethnicity that has been so heavily abused by the ruling ethnicity, like black people, or also Muslims at this point in the United States. But I think it is ultimately a very wrong-headed notion that will just lead to more hostility and more violence and more death and mayhem. Now, how we deal with this and where we draw the line and where we use social condemnation as opposed to where we use the power of the law and the power of the state, that is a much more sophisticated conversation that again, is something that should be judged more or less on a case-by-case basis, as opposed to just laying down one rule for everything. Ultimately, I don't think it's a good idea for people to try to organize based upon race or ethnicity, because ultimately there is no genetic basis for race. It doesn't exist on the genetic level. There is a cultural basis for race, but that cultural basis for race is a result of, specific political structures within our society, and a number of these political structures, like the state, I think both Keith and I can agree on that, are harmful oftentimes and do more harm than good. And we as a society and we as a species need to move beyond them. And if we do not move beyond them, we run the very real risk of destroying ourselves, both on the micro and the macro level.
So my one question, well, I'm sorry, I got a few questions.
Yeah.
Do you see any principled difference between voluntary segregation and coercive segregation?
Oh, absolutely, there's a difference. Coercive segregation is worse than voluntary segregation. Depending upon the type of voluntary segregation, I think they're both bad. And some forms of voluntary segregation, I might take direct action or use my words or symbols, to express my opinion about it. Whereas others I might look at a little more kindly, just based upon, how likely this is to injure people in both the short and the long term.
Sure. So I know a woman who was assaulted by a man and just has not had great interactions with men historically, and she will only associate roommate-wise. She will only accept a roommate who is a woman. Do you think she is morally justified in excluding 3.5 billion people, half the human race, and saying I will only have a woman as a roommate?
I think she is. So, okay, when I was in college, I got mugged. I was outside in my car digging for like a copy of the DVD Equilibrium. I was going to take it, me and my girlfriend were going to watch it. And these two black guys in hoods came around the corner and attacked me. They pulled a pistol and started raking it down my face. They called me the N-word a number of times. In fact, actually, hang on. We were talking about paintings earlier. I actually painted this a few weeks after I was attacked. And each one of the red things on here actually stands for like a blow I took from that gun. Now, in the short term, after I was attacked, there was about a week, 2 week, maybe a month period, I was afraid of black people. Like it was just a reaction, a little bit of PTSD just because of how traumatic that incident was. My brain at the time knew that's racist. It's not right to discriminate against black people that way, but I had that visceral reaction. And that I could not control. Then a little while after that, that faded away. And I stopped being afraid of black people. But then for about 6 months, I was afraid of anyone who looked even slightly off. I remember I was walking to an audition with a friend of mine. We were in St. Louis, so it was a different city. And a homeless man, a white homeless man, walked by us with, I don't know, he had like a 40 or a thing of tea and like a brown paper bag. And my friend looked down and he saw my fist clenched and shaking. And he's like, dude, what are you doing? And I was like, I was waiting for him to swing that bottle at my head. Now, this was paranoid. This was a result of trauma. I was in a place where I eventually needed, where I was triggered, essentially. And then as I went on with my life and as that faded into the background and as I moved to New York City and lived in Harlem, in a neighborhood where I was the minority, that fear dissipated and was gone. So, I mean, what I would say of the woman who has had I'm going to assume this is a history of domestic violence with men, I don't think it is, I don't think it's immoral for her to say, I don't want a male roommate if she's had problems with a male roommate. And I don't see any reason why men would, in that individual instance, be put out of housing just because they can't have that one roommate with her. But also I would say that what she is doing is it's coming out of a place, an illogical place that's born of fear created by abuse. And so I would say that, if she doesn't want that fear to rule her for the rest of her life, take steps to deal with that and to overcome that past, because ultimately, those were specific men that abused her, and, hashtag not all men. But the fact is that most men are not going to do that. We are not, we're not all monsters. Unfortunately, she met a few, and the human brain has ways of locking onto that. So, I mean, yeah, I'd say she's morally justified, but also I think that, it would be in her best interest to move beyond that and to get to a point where one day she might be okay with the idea of having a male roommate.
Well,
sure. Oh, I'm
Keith,
sorry,
I'm gonna
Sean.
jump in real quick. So for me, and Brent touched on this a little bit, but the important distinction is when you have one group with societal or institutional power, and that group is discriminating against a group that lacks power, has been historically victimized, or however you want to put it. And there's just, you have to think about like the dynamics between groups. There's a completely different dynamic between men and women as there is between white people and black people historically. And so I don't want that distinction to get lost in like these other examples. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah. There is the principled approach of, does one have the right to discriminate against the other? And then there's, well, does one group have more societal power I certainly see that. However, just because one has historically been discriminated against, the example I used earlier, because I do believe it's a legitimate example, when the draft by law only applies to men and it's forced labor under some of the worst conditions you can imagine. I mean, we have, I don't know, the sinking of the Maine based on a lie. World War I, the Lusitania did have ammunitions. World War II, there was the McCullen memo where FDR had intentionally provoked the Japanese through the Export Control Act of 1940. The Korean War, the Vietnam Gulf of Tonkin War, these are all wars based on lies that enslaved men under the worst conditions possible. Yet, I still think you have the right to discriminate against men. Even though they've been so mistreated, I don't see how that...
Well, hang on.
Yeah.
I get what you're saying here. So first off, the draft and selective service, that's been opened up, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know if women, women are now able to serve in the military. So the fact that women weren't drafted, that was a law created by men and imposed on other men that specifically excluded women. And that was part of women being oppressed. It wasn't that women, women had to actually fight to have the right to join the military, and they were excluded from joining the military by law until like in all of our lifetime. So I don't know if you can really say that the draft is an example of men being abused. I would say like men, like it's certain men being abused because it's the poor, it's the workers, it's the people who can't afford to buy their way out of the draft, or like in Spain, for instance, when there was the war going on in Morocco, the rich would buy workers' sons to take their own children's place. I remember famous anarchist Buenaventura Durruti specifically talking about that. So that's more of a class-based antagonism than an entirely sex-based antagonism. And even if we were to say that that's an example of men being abused based on their sex, that's male-on-male violence. It's men forcing other men to be drafted as opposed to women forcing men to be drafted.
Well,
So
Keith, I'm curious on what basis you're saying it would be justified to discriminate against men in that way.
On what basis I'm saying it would be?
Are you making a consequentialist argument?
No, I am making an attempt at a principled argument that human beings have the right to discriminate for whatever reason. So let's look at the case of men or women or blacks or whatever. I was just using that as an example. So I was saying I do believe that men have been discriminated against because it by law said men only by the draft, even though it was by other men. As an individualist, I don't see that, hey, as you're being enslaved, don't worry, it's by someone by your own gender. I mean,
but if it's other men, then clearly it's a class-based antagonism there. I'm
sorry to push back on this, but it said all males. So right now, selective service is all males 18 to 26. It's not poor males, even though they're weak on enforcement. It literally says the word male in the law. So that is my justification for assuming that it's gender-based as opposed to class-based.
Well, again, it is gender-based it is explicitly gender-based, but in actual practice, it's class-based.
How about this? How about if it said only blacks should be forced to work against their will, but in reality, rich blacks like Jay-Z were allowed to buy their way out of it? Would you say that that's not racist?
I mean, again, that's a completely different situation because it would be a government composed of primarily white men passing that law about blacks and then exempting Jay-Z. Now, if we lived in some imagine alternate universe America where blacks were the majority and had the majority of political power, and then said all blacks must do this, but actually only poor blacks did it, well, clearly that's class-based antagonism. It only is masquerading as race-based antagonism.
All right, Sean. Did you want to pick up from here?
Well, yeah. I'm just wondering if you recognize, Keith, if you recognize the difference, like in terms of the consequence between having a group with power discriminate a group against a group without power, as opposed to groups with equal power discriminating against like themselves, I guess, or one another.
Yes, I do see a difference. So, for example, it's not just because one group is a majority. You can have very few people and still have a lot of power. For example, there's a great deal of Jewish influence in society. I don't think because, well, the Jews are powerful, so discriminating against them doesn't count, but discriminating against group X who doesn't have that much power is the same. I see these powers definitely changing over time. Sometimes there's power in different areas, the media versus banking versus government versus business versus social media. I definitely see these things as changing over time. So what I attempt to do is have a principled approach that we could apply consistently, regardless of who is currently in power. I see these as variables, ABC, that could be interchangeable, but I see the principle as the same. Human beings should not be coerced to associate with people against their will. I realize we have a different opinion on, coercion and force, but I would prefer each of us to be very clear in our opposition. We're probably not going to convince the other person, unfortunately. I just want to make my position totally clear that for the same reason I believe Hooters has the right to discriminate against hiring men for waitresses, that strip clubs have the right to discriminate against hiring men, whites have the right to discriminate against blacks, or straights have the right to discriminate against gays in their sex life, who they're roommates with. I mean, so you had mentioned earlier, I'm sorry to move around like this, but you had mentioned that it was you had mentioned that it was irrational of the woman to discriminate against the man. From the statistics that I'm familiar with, a man, let's take the babysitter case that I mentioned earlier. A man, I think, is like, 20 times more likely than a woman to engage in sexual abuse. So if someone engages in discrimination against men for their own safety, I don't see what is in principle wrong with that. Well, so that is my general position. I'm against coerced association in every realm, sleeping with people, being roommates, working for them, working with them, selling to them. That is what I would say is my final statement. I'll allow Brent to make his final statement.
I think Sean had something to say.
Yeah, just to bring home my point real quick. So if a woman says she doesn't want male roommates, there's not like across.
I don't think there's a civil rights case that's going to be brought.
Exactly. There's not tons of men who can't find roommates necessarily. I mean, it's a little harder. I've definitely seen that online. Like most of the posts by women do say they only want other female roommates.
Some of the posts by creepy men say I only want female roommates.
Exactly. And so I don't know. From my perspective, I've never had problems finding like a place to live because I was a man. So that's the difference.
Do gays have real trouble getting wedding cakes? Are there no cake places that gays can get?
I think it's.
Gays couldn't even get married until a few years ago. I mean, they explicitly could not get married during the Bush administration, and it wasn't until late into the Obama administration that gays were even allowed to get married. So this is like really, really new, and it's only been recently that the cultural bigots have. They've moved their sights over from gays to trans people because they saw which way they saw which way the wind was blowing. But the thing is, again, and I think when you talk about specifically about the wedding cake issue, you've also got to understand that with regard to the wedding cake issue, that's also a bit of a grift. When I talked earlier about the economy that springs up around bigots, if you look at a lot of these Christian places that said, oh, I refuse to allow gay people, I will not bake a wedding cake for gay people, or I won't serve pizza to gay people, they would get on the news and then they would get thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars donated to them by other bigots. And like really I honestly think in a lot of ways this is a grift that they run for themselves. Now maybe not in every case, but there's definitely an economy that has sprung up around this in just the same way that like that woman Kim Davis, who refused to marry gay people after gay marriage was legal, became a mini celebrity and got all this money and attention. I think it's kind of ridiculous.
I definitely agree it's ridiculous. And I hate people who discriminate based on arbitrary things. People who discriminate on ideas and things that people choose, I actually kind of like. That sort of spices things up, tells me that these people are up for intellectual exchanges. I'm curious, what do you think should someone say that I own an Airbnb and say no blacks or no Jews? What do you think should happen to me because I refuse to sell to, say, blacks and Jews?
I mean, what do I think should happen to you? I think probably. So I would hope that you would have a reprimand that would get you out of the business of renting an Airbnb to people. Now, how that reprimand would come, I'm not a judge. I'm not God, so I don't know if I can say exactly how much punishment is enough punishment for that. But someone who does that absolutely should be punished by society because we can't allow that kind of behavior to go on. Because if we do, it will lead to terrible things happening to blacks and Jews or whoever you were trying to exclude. Now, again, this is another thing that people don't seem to understand with this is so let's say that you are an Airbnb person and you don't want blacks or Jews, but instead of putting it on the ad, you just find a reason not to respond to the emails of people who have names or profile pictures that look like that. Now, people do that all the time, and it's disgusting. I want to make that clear, but they can easily get away with it. So if you are an Airbnb person, or if you are I've been a boss before, I've been a hiring manager, and if I wanted to discriminate against someone in my hiring, I could easily do it with the rules that we have now, just implicitly, whether I even know that I'm doing it or not. That can happen. It shouldn't happen, and it's disgusting when it does, but it can happen. To go beyond that situation and to make it law that this behavior is explicitly okay and allowed by our society, that's beyond the pale. In terms of how this kind of stuff can happen. So really, whenever you hear someone say like, "Oh, how this is so terrible that I can't rent out my apartment to that I have to show my apartment to blacks," that person is so much more of a bigot than they actually are letting on. Because if they were really just a bigot and just didn't want a black family in that apartment that they were renting, they could easily make that happen. But they take it another step and another step. So what you got to understand is what is being communicated and what is not being said that goes on underneath the surface. Like when Mike Enoch says, I just want a nice place for white people because of freedom of association. But then later on, he has a guy on his show who calls himself an unironic exterminationist and literally says that there is no form of segregation that can work, and you just have to kill all of the black people. Like, and he's friends with this guy and has him on his show a whole bunch of times. There's what the racist and the bigot says, and then there's what they actually want to do that they don't say because they know there will be consequences for it.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that's as much as I hate National Socialism as any other form of statism.
It's not a form of statism. It is a form of statism. I thought you were going to say socialism. I was about to jump all over you for it. Go.
Okay. You know what? I know better around you. I think this is the third time we've spoken. So as far as, oh, Jesus, I was going to say, I'll just move on. So you believe that I should, oh, sorry about that. You believe that I should be reprimanded for discriminating against some people based on accidents of birth. Do you believe Hooters should be forced to hire male waiters?
I mean, that's different because Hooters is a restaurant that caters to a very specific experience. So a Hooters hiring a male waiter, it kind of violates the whole point of Hooters. Same thing with a strip club. What we understand with a strip club is that it is a female-only strip club. But, you know, there's Chippendales. There's there are male strip clubs as well. These businesses are segregated based upon gender, but it's because of the clientele that they are catering to. Now, an Applebee's, where the whole point is not to have a sexy young woman in short shorts, like they should have action taken against them if they refuse to hire male servers, for instance. Okay.
And my point on this, just to clarify my position, I don't see a principal difference in, well, but here's the customers that they're trying to get. Well, maybe we're only trying to get straight customers, so we exclude gays from wedding cakes. I don't see the principal difference on why you should be forcing someone to make a cake against their will. If they don't want to, I want to know who these people are. So
no, it's not about the customers that they're trying to get. It's the experience that they're explicitly trying to give. It's like, that's the point of their business. Like Hooters, their whole thing is sexy girls. Like if there were no sexy girls, there is no Hooters. It's just another restaurant. In the same, that's their brand. In the same way as like a male strip club, or is going to, they're delivering a specific experience that is different from a standard restaurant. So you can give them a little more leeway there. Now, also, Hooters is kind of gross. I mean,
I've wasted so much money there that I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
As far as, okay, so the reason that I wanted to have this conversation is I feel that it gets at the heart of the anarcho-capitalist, anarcho-communist, basically disagreement. I'm curious, why do you oppose the state or government?
I mean, I oppose the state because it tends to do more harm than good. So, and this actually kind of ties into racial discrimination, because we can talk about this, because this is one of the many negative aspects of the state and the way the state operates. So first off, the state is not the government in the sense that it is not the politicians. The politicians, the state is specifically the military and the police, and the difference between the state and government is the difference between, the mayor of Minneapolis and that cop that murdered George Floyd. It's the difference between a senator and a CIA spook. And the fact is, between the two of them, when you get rid of the state, which is the organization that maintains a monopoly over the justified use of force within a given geographical region, the government becomes a suggestion box. It becomes a sounding board for society where we all get together and talk about how we want things to go, without that force of law to back it up, without the iron fist behind the invisible hand. So I oppose the state because, one, it does not protect us. For instance, after the Roman Empire fell, we talk about that period as the Dark Ages. But really, if you looked overall, fewer people died violent deaths between the period of the fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of the nation state, when it was just feudal wars and people were, there were bandits, probably, you had a lot of things, but there was not this ability to organize massive armies for the purposes of conquest. Similarly, without the state, you could not have had World War I. You could not have had World War II. The atomic bomb never would have been developed. So even when we've entered into an era of unprecedented peace and prosperity to a certain extent, that peace and prosperity in the fallout of World War II is a result of the atomic bomb, which is hanging over us all like a sword of Damocles. And the only reason we're not fighting like we used to would be if we were to fight like we used to, we would wipe ourselves out. But really, it's only going to take the wrong person in the White House, the wrong person, the wrong person pushing a button or making a bad judgment call, and suddenly 90% to 100% of all humans on this planet are destroyed, along with who knows how many other species. So it's just too big of a risk for us to have these social institutions. They seem to protect us, but they actually cause more damage. Now, in the specific case of race, the state is that's what creates race. I mean, you can even go back and look at the founding of America before like slavery was codified. You saw the laws that came down, and the original black and white indentured servants were originally virtually equal. What happened was that after slave revolts took place, where the blacks and where the indentured servitude blacks and the indentured servitude whites got together and fought against the people that had brought them to this country and fought for their freedom and tried to join the Indians, bam, you had laws that advantaged the poor whites over the poor blacks, and you had laws that specifically punished them for interbreeding and fraternizing. This is obviously what happens is that the state looks to manage populations that it sees as unruly for whatever reason, whether they are unruly or they're not. And then what it does is it looks for a way to easily identify them. Race, because it is based on physical characteristics like skin color, hair texture, family, it's easy to group these people in and say everyone in this category is unruly, and therefore you better watch it. And the people who are like, wait, I'm not unruly. They're like, well, then you better watch yourself and you better apologize for all the other unruly people that look like you, or we'll just make it just as bad for you. So what happens essentially is that slavery, colonialism, all of these horrible practices are creations of the state and of sovereign power that are based upon what is convenient for a small overclass of property owners, as opposed to actual genetic or social facts. And this has led to horrible abuses throughout our history in every major, cultural every single major cultural blunder that we've ever made. It's all a product of the centralization of power that the state has. It's a very subtle thing, and it's something that happens not necessarily as a result of a grand conspiracy of a few people, but just what happens when you have a hierarchical institution dedicated to maintaining a monopoly over the justified use of force in a given geographical area that then uses that force to defend the property and the interests of its primary constituents.
Go ahead, Keith. I definitely have some things to say to that, but I'm going to let you get the first attempt, Keith.
You know what? I just had two other questions for Brent, just because my whole thing on this is I want to get clarity on where we disagree, because I like Brent so much that I'm sure it's more of a misunderstanding rather than one of us being evil. And if it is, it's probably me, because he certainly seems like a gentleman. Please go on.
You're not evil, Keith. I like you a lot too. Thank you.
I appreciate that. Thanks.
So continue. What were the questions?
Yeah, you can go ahead with your questions if you want. Keith?
Oh, I'm sorry. Brent, what do you think do you think there's any moral or principle difference between a corporation and a state?
The difference is power. Whether, like, if a corporation manages to claim a total monopoly over the justified use of force in a given geographical, that's a state. So I would consider a corporation, like if you talked about, like, for instance, private law enforcement or a mercenary company like Blackwater, these are larval states or potential states, and they will become a state once they claim that power. And they will lose that, they will cease to be a state once that monopoly is lost.
So my general response to corporation versus the state would be something like, if we take General Motors can't get any money out of my pocket unless I voluntarily give it to them or choose to work for them and choose to contract with them. The state, on the other hand, says, here is what you will pay. If you don't, we'll put you in a cage and shoot you if you resist. By the way, here's 50,000 other laws that if we catch you disobeying, even though you haven't contracted with us, we're going to cage you for those based on the interpretation of our judges. That I would see as the first major difference. The second important difference is the corporation only gets power or claims rulership over property that it's voluntarily acquired through just acquisition, meaning voluntary exchange, or homesteading. So the difference between me making rules for my house versus Donald Trump making rules for America is Donald Trump has not justly acquired America. He does not rightfully own millions of people's houses. However, the reason that I own my house is because I traded it with voluntarily by the construction company that built it. Therefore, with regards to others, I have the better claim to it. That is my principled difference between a corporation and the state. It's not just size. There is a principled difference, I think.
Well, I see what you're saying there, and I've heard this argument before, but what you're forgetting is the reason that GM has that relationship with you right now is the state has created laws that create that relationship with you. If you removed that state from then what would happen is you would have a power vacuum, and other organizations would vie to take the state's place and claim its power. So, for instance, let's say GM then contracts Blackwater. Suddenly GM has that power, and then GM has the ability to tax you or rewrite the laws in any way that it wants to. Again, it's like, think of it like, this is the dumbest way to put it, but think of it like evolving Pokemon. You know, you've got like the freaking Pikachu GM, and then you've got like the Raichu state, and it's when the corporation or any other organization, it could be a corporation, could be a church or whatever, just once it claims that monopoly over the justified use of force and it has the ability to enforce it, it becomes a completely different organization, and your relationship to it completely changes. In much the same way that if, like people, I've said this before, like the Sizzler. You're used to getting your way at the Sizzler because the Sizzler does not have the ability to beat you up and throw you in prison. If you give the Sizzler waiters guns and you give them the ability to jail whoever they want, they're going to start acting like cops. The final thing that I wanted to answer was with homesteading. And homesteading is explicitly, and I know this does go back to John Locke and you mix your labor with the land, but homesteading, there are explicit homestead laws that created the homesteading custom in the United States. Similarly, in England, you had the Enclosure Acts. And this was the Enclosure Acts that created capitalism, that created the rules that we're all working under, that Adam Smith was reacting to. these were brutal crackdowns on the Scots, who during the Jacobite Rebellion were trying to maintain feudalism in the face of a very aggressive and expansionist capitalism. So what's happening here is these things happened a long, long time ago, and they have been encoded into human culture for so long that it's very easy to see them as an inherent part of human culture that will exist whether the government is there or not. But the fact is that, like race, these types of customs are creations of the state. They 100% spring from state violence, and when that state violence goes away, those customs also will eventually erode.
Okay, and my final question, or no, I'm sorry, I got two more. My understanding of socialism is, well, it starts with communism. In 1848, Marx describing communism as the abolition of private property. My understanding of socialism, that what makes it unique is the institutionalized aggression against private property, and capitalism or free markets as the recognition of private property. I'm curious, what is your definition of socialism?
Socialism to me is worker ownership of the means of production. So institutionalized aggression against private property. And this is why it's very important to understand that there was a socialist movement well before Marx, and there was communism well before Marx. I mean, we even had primitive communism before the rise of the nation state, and that's how humans have lived on this planet. We were all communists up until about 6,000 years ago, when we started working with settled agriculture. And settled agriculture, that was not, people did not freely choose settled agriculture. You can even go back and look at the fossil and the dental records, and you'll find that people that remained in the hunter-gatherer lifestyle had better nutrition than those who lived in the settled agriculture. And a lot of the times, the only tribes that were able to maintain this without being conquered were the people in the mountains. Mountain folk are hard to control. And they were like kind of the last bastions. And that was like the big that was the first city versus country antagonism that we had. So communism and socialism has come a long, long way since then. And Marx made a huge splash because of a number of things. One, Marx is a seminal figure, and the only other person I can really think of in history to compare him to is, like, in terms of impact, is like William Shakespeare. Marx is one of the most influential writers, philosophers, and thinkers and economists in the West. And the fact that his ideas were then put into place by the Bolsheviks and whole countries were run off of them, that's why everybody thinks of Marx when they think of socialism. But socialism vastly pervades Marx. And for instance, my version of socialism and communism is decidedly non-Marxist and anti-state. So what happened with the idea of socialism attacking private property, you have to understand that property is theft, that property itself is created by an attack, even when it doesn't attack anybody individually. And you've seen this if you look at what Tecumseh said to the whites when he came in and was talking about how ridiculous it was to sell a country, to why not sell the air or the great sea as well as the earth, that this was made for everyone. To make something property, you have to have the force you have to possess it, and you have to have the force and ability to defend it and prevent anyone else from taking it. So when Marx is talking about, taking private property, what he's talking about and what anarchists are talking about is not so much going and taking somebody's house or their livelihood or anything. What they're talking about is the workers are already the ones in these factories. They already possess them. They already know how to do everything that they need to make the business function. But what's happening is because of the business titles and because of the legal justifications of the state and the era from the nobility going down to the capitalist class, there is another party in here who owns the product of their labor. Literally, when you work for, when a Chinese worker in a factory in one of the special economic zones in China builds an iPhone, he doesn't own that iPhone. He can't even buy an iPhone. That iPhone is owned by Apple. Why is the iPhone owned by Apple? Because Apple paid the money and they have the contracts and they arranged all of this stuff to come together. And I'm not going to say that there's no value that is added in the arrangement and in the creation of a business, because there is. But at the same time, the capitalist class literally functions as economic dictators. And that's why Marx used the phrase, for instance, the dictatorship of the proletariat. It's contrast explicitly with the dictatorship of capital. So it's not so much a literal dictatorship in the sense that, Lenin and, the North Korea thought, but really what he's saying is that the people that actually operate the machines that run the businesses, that make the deliveries, these are the people that should own the businesses and make the important economic decisions, as opposed to the capitalist class. Again, it's aggression. You can look at that as aggression against somebody, but you're drawing a very arbitrary line against aggression. It's the same thing as you see that line where it's like, oh, why do you have this estate? Oh, well, I got it from my father. Okay, well, where did your father get it? Well, he got it from his father. Where did his father get it? Oh, he fought for it. Okay, then we'll fight you for it. You see where that goes? And I don't necessarily think it's a good idea for everybody to start fighting. I think that's probably a very, very bad idea. But the idea that socialism is an imposition on established just property rights of capitalism is just ridiculous. And it's ahistorical and simply isn't how property actually functions with humans.
All right, Sean, did you have anything for either of us? I really just had one final thing I wanted to ask Brent about.
Yeah, I have some things to ask both of you. Okay, so first, Brent. So in your system, you're opposed to the state, but you're not opposed to government, right?
Yeah, I mean, certain forms of government I'm more hostile to than others, but yeah, I think it's a fundamentally good idea for people to get together and talk with each other and try to come up with a way that we should all behave in public. I think that's in everyone's best interest.
So how do we, as a society, incentivize people to act good and to not act badly?
I mean, there's a lot of ways that we can incentivize them, because I mean, right now we don't do a very good job of incentivizing people to act good and to not act badly. People become, millionaires by doing horrible things, millionaires and billionaires. Elon Musk's fortune was made in a number of ways. Well, first, he was born rich. His father wound up being in a position to get half of an emerald mine in like colonized Africa. So like literally like the dude benefited from imperialism. But then also a lot of the money that was made by PayPal was made by stealing people's money who used PayPal and closing out their accounts and just keeping what was kept in it. So, a lot of the time, the economic system that we have does not incentivize ethical and socially desirable behavior. We like to think that it does, but it really doesn't. And in fact, most psychopaths are drawn to Wall Street, for instance, where they're normally 1% of the population. They're like 10 to 20% of all stockbrokers are psychopaths. And that leads to stuff like what happened in 2008 with the crash of 2008. So I would say, to incentivize people to behave well, I think what we need to do is we need to make society smaller, and we need to function in such a way as where everyone has a stake in their community, and everyone is in a position where we can all help each other, but not in a position where there are these huge high highs in society. Like you think about somebody who's like a manic depressive, and they take a mood stabilizer to eliminate their low lows and eliminate their high highs, and to just kind of keep them within a even, more or less an even keel where they can function within society without being a danger to themselves or others. I'm not saying everyone that's manic depressive is a danger. I'm just using that as an example. I think we should do something similar economically, where we chip away at the rich, and similarly we raise up the poor. And really these two things are, because you can't be rich without a huge amount of poor people, or vice versa. As to how to actually do that, I mean, look into the history of the anarchist movement. We tend to function via GAs, which is General Assemblies, where all people can come and make their voice heard. Everyone gets one vote. And if you like what's going on, great. If you don't like what's going on, you can disassociate and go find another group somewhere else. A lot of the times it's our property relations that keep us tied to a specific place and that keep us tied to a specific job. And I think we can move beyond that. As we move into the future, I'm actually really interested in what's called swarm technology, which is a way to aggregate individual human input that outperforms both markets and experts. So really it outperforms capitalism and central planning. And this has been proven in limited experiments. Like, for instance, they were able to use swarm technology to take human opinions and aggregate them in such a way that they were able to correctly identify all the winners of the Kentucky Derby, outperforming the market, the Vegas odds, and outperforming the experts, which would have been, the economic planners. As to how to actually do that on like a city, country, or international level, that's a job for someone whose brain works differently than mine and really understands programming in this kind of technology.
Is that essentially what the Venus Project is?
I'm not sure, to tell you the truth. I'm a little skeptical of the Venus Project because I keep thinking it's associated with that 9/11 truther film Zeitgeist. But there are some people who
it is.
Yeah. So I'm very skeptical of that, because I remember when I first saw Zeitgeist, I went on a crusade against it. What I have seen, some of the stuff that has come out of the Venus Project, and I have some comrades that were associated with the Venus Project. I think Lee Camp of Redacted Tonight, he was on my show twice. Was coming from the Venus Project. So there are some good ideas that are coming out of that. It's just ever since I saw that Zeitgeist movie, anybody that posts it or had anything to do with it, I just side eye.
Fair enough. So, well, you kind of pointed how we could make society better through controlling the economy different. But what if there is someone you want to disassociate, or does something to hurt someone, and he doesn't give a fuck about what you want, what your rules are?
You're talking about law enforcement, essentially?
Yeah.
So I would look at how anarchists handle law enforcement, and also about how law enforcement was actually done before we had a formalized police force. Because, big surprise, we actually didn't do that for the longest time. In the South, police forces were slave-catching organizations, and then they were just made police forces after the South lost the Civil War. And in the North, police forces tended to be just thugs for hire. It's very funny to see ANCAPs and libertarians arguing for private police now, because that's how police started in the North, as private police that the rich and the merchant class would hire. And it was the merchant class actually that made them into public servants because they didn't want to continue to pay the high prices they had to pay. So they said, let's have everybody pay for it through taxes and we will pay less. So a private police force, literally, and I think the first police force in the country was the Boston Police. Before that, it was the local constable, and the constable was it was a position that was shared among everyone in the community, and everyone took shifts being the constable and the night watchman, and it was really handled on the community level, on the individual family level, and it was a burden that everyone shouldered together. And I would say that I'm not necessarily saying we go back to that, but if you look at that and you also look at how anarchist justice has been carried out in anarchist Catalonia, for instance, and now that was a war zone, so things are going to be a little more heated there. But I think the idea of a police force in the sense of a non-professional militia made up of members of the community in which they inhabit, where everyone draws the same pay and there is no formal rank, or if there is formal rank, it's very minor in the sense that, yeah, there's a guy that everyone has agreed is what he says goes because he's the smartest one here, but he doesn't get to live in a different area. He doesn't get a big mansion for, he's not the commissioner of, the NYPD or whatever. I think if we cease to, again, make these high highs and to really elevate certain individuals high above everyone else in terms of power, and we keep things down to the local community level, I really think that humans can handle these kinds of problems in a much more peaceful way, as opposed to when we create these massive institutions that then become incredibly corrupt and wind up beating and killing people like what we're seeing across the country, which is one of the reasons why I definitely support defunding the police.
And so there would be no private property, right?
There would be no private property, but there would be personal property. So the way anarchists have traditionally done property is like property is what you have and hold at the time that you have it. And if you abandon it, then somebody else can take it. And if like for instance, or if someone else is using that property on your behalf and giving you some of the money. So say, for instance, I have a tractor and my neighbor wants to use my tractor so that he can, plow some fields and sell hay to Home Depot. I might say, yeah, you can use my tractor for that. And, we'll work out a deal together about the use of the tractor. That small relationship between the two of us, that's fairly healthy. I don't think anybody can abuse the other person. I can't say, give me 90% of the haul or you don't get my tractor or whatever, because they'll just say, screw you, I'll find someone else. But if I am Tractor Co. and I control all the tractors in the tri-state area, and you've got to make, do you see how the poison is in the dose and the matter of degrees that we have? So does that answer your question? I'm not hearing you. Do your mic is off or something?
Yeah, I think so. I think that mostly answers it. So essentially, a lot of decisions about resources would be decided by the community as a whole.
Yeah, the decision can be made by the GA, and if you don't like the decision of the GA, you can leave the community. Essentially, think about how this would work in practice if there were no police, if there were no state. Well, imagine, for instance, you have Amazon, and Amazon decides they don't want to pay Jeff Bezos anymore. He's done enough. He's got his millions of dollars. We're just going to let Jeff Bezos be Jeff Bezos, and we're going to run things the way we want to and divide the money equally among everybody, or however we want to do that. Without a police force to call, Jeff Bezos is up shit creek without a paddle. So essentially, like in an anarchist society, it works itself out in practice. Without the presence of the police force and the state to create the institution of private property to then mandate certain ways of dealing with property that you own but do not control or operate. Essentially, with anarchists, traditionally, the property that you have a right to the property that you have and you use, and you do not have a right to the property that you do not have and do not use. And if anything needs to move beyond that level, that's worked out collectively with everyone functioning as equals, as opposed to a board of directors and an owner commanding, the fate of millions.
I can keep asking questions, but Keith, do you have any questions about any of this?
No, I mean, I think him and I have made our points pretty clearly. Unless there's anything else you have for either of us, I think I made my points about people own themselves. They have the right to contract just because they build something and trades or other voluntary contracts. I don't think that justly excludes them from a future title. I think as far as power relations go, sometimes it's good that Chris Rock has 10 million fans across America and I have like 100. Yes, that creates a great power differential, but some people are so much better and so much clever at, making computers, making houses, that it's okay to give them a lot more societal power. How many people are as good as Steve Jobs as what he does? How many people can build a house as efficiently as local construction companies? How many people are as talented as Kobe Bryant or LeBron James? So I am not confident enough that I have the ability to forcibly stop these people from making trades, because if there are a couple good people with really good ideas, I want to make sure they have the ability to contract with millions of people, and they are at different skill levels. For example, people that are just starting on the job have no clue about how the business operates compared to the person who started the organization. But maybe we disagree. Maybe a worker-owned cooperative will absolutely run all the bourgeoisie businesses out of the market, or people won't even care about money, as we could see now with Tucker Carlson's ratings at 4.1 million, higher than they've ever been, and Tucker is losing people. So maybe I'm just like, anything voluntary, if it's based on voluntarism and contract and negotiation, I support it. If it's based on initiating aggression against peaceful people and any property they voluntarily acquired or homesteaded, because with regards to others, if you homesteaded, I think you have a better claim than others who have not used it. That is my final position. So I just wanted to make my myself clear. I gotta get running, gentlemen. So Brent, if you could please, I don't want to cut you off. I definitely want my audience to be clear on where you stand, and of course, Sean. So I know I said it 30 minutes ago that was my final statement, but this officially is and because I started, I am going to ask that you finish us off here.
Sure, I'll go really fast here. All right, so first off, you mentioned that people own themselves. This is not the case. Ownership, this assumes a relationship, like ownership implies the owner and the owned. So owning yourself makes no sense. What you want to say is you want to say that you have a right to autonomy. And that's much more important than an owner argument. Like, ownership itself comes out of Roman law, and it is the ability to use, abuse, or destroy that which is owned for any reason or no reason whatsoever. So I have a couch. I can paint that couch any color. I can set that couch on fire and throw it out the window. It's my property. It's very bad to think of humans as property, because then what happens is that you presuppose the same relationship with your fellow man that you have with a toaster, or even if it's a big thing like a shiny new car. The people are not replaceable, and what a human is so much more than what property is. And when you treat people like property, that is the beginning of tyranny. That is the beginning of every horrible thing that has ever happened to humans, and every great disaster that we've ever done. Heidegger talked about this. You can look it up. The process is called enframing. And you even see it's when you think too technologically, and you start to see your environment and even yourself as existing for something else as opposed to being there in its own right. Charlie Chaplin's famous thing where he talks about in The Great Dictator, machine men with machine minds and machine hearts. That's really what self-ownership is, and it has a place in the philosophy of of John Locke and is used as an ideological justification, but also mixing your labor with property simply does not create a property relationship. If I take a can of tomato juice and I pour that into the ocean, I've just mixed my labor with the ocean. Do I own the ocean now? No, I just lost my tomato juice. This type of property relationship I find to be destructive ultimately, even when it's gone into in the best possible circumstances. And also this property relationship is itself, as I've shown earlier, a creation of the state. I think we need to get back to a people-centered society where people are the most important thing in our society, where they are more important than profit, where they are more important than luxury, and where one person's right to life and liberty is more important than all the millionaires in the world's right to their millions and their property and their luxury. I think that if we play the game where we're each trying to win King of the Mountain, there's only one winner, and there are a lot of losers. And I think it's much better that we find a new game and a better game to play that promotes human flourishing. So yeah, check me out. My website's brentonlengle.com. I have another debate coming up on Modern Day Debate in 2 weeks. It's going to be on capitalism. You can also see my debate with JF. And my buddy Caleb Maupin tomorrow will be debating Adam Kokesh, also on Modern Day Debate. So definitely check that out.
Cool. Well, I don't really have any final comment beyond.
Subscribe to my YouTube channel.
yeah, exactly. I'm going to be having a lot more conversations on my channel. Just anything dealing with political disagreements, trying to get at the heart of disagreement. And so that's what I'm trying to do. And yeah, that's it. I appreciate you guys involving me today. And yeah,
this was a lot of fun. Thanks, folks.
Of course, gentlemen. Thanks so much for your time. Take care.